Frederick Douglass's narrative, which he revised several times in the course of his life, is probably the keystone text for a description of essentially an everyman in slavery. He moved about, he had a large number of owners, he early on contrived to educate himself, and by the time he achieved maturity from ages 16 to 18, I think he set his sights on escaping, which he ultimately did. He went on to write his narrative to become an effective orator and spokesman in the anti-slavery and abolitionist movement, but essentially his life story provides us, I think, with some of the most unvarnished episodes in the lives of slaves. I think what makes his narrative particularly affecting for me and for other readers is to realize that as powerful as this narrative is, it is one story among millions that never were told. And so we return to Douglass's narrative frequently to kind of clear away the mythology that surrounded slavery in the American South, and the myth of the happy slave, for example, the friendly plantation, while even Douglass talks about the great house where many wanted to serve. It was always within those constraints of cruelty, physical punishment, and the fact that you were enslaved and could never of your own accord leave. What I find interesting, among many things, in Douglass's narrative is his depiction of the slave owners and the overseers. Post-colonial studies tell us that the oppressed people always see their oppressors with 20/20 vision, and certainly that's borne out by slave narratives by Douglass and others. Let me just read one passage for you in which he characterizes an overseer named Plummer and describes one of Douglass's earliest introductions into the violence that accompanies enslavement. Mr. Plummer was a miserable drunkard, a profane swearer, and a savage monster. He always went armed with a cowskin, that is, with a whip, and a heavy cudgel. I have known him to cut and slash the women's heads so horribly that even Master would be enraged at his cruelty and would threaten to whip him if he did not mind himself. Master, however, was not a humane slaveholder. It required extraordinary barbarity on the part of the overseer to affect him. He would at times seem to take great pleasure in whipping a slave. I've often been awakened at the dawn of the day by the most heartrending shrieks of my own aunt, whom he used to tie up to a joist and whip her upon her naked back till she was literally covered with blood. No words, no tears, no prayers from his gory victim seemed to move his iron heart from its bloody purpose. The louder she screamed, the harder he whipped, and where the blood ran fastest, there he whipped longest. He would whip her to make her scream, and whip her to make her hush, and not until overcome by fatigue would he cease to swing the blood-clotted cowskin. I remember the first time I ever witnessed this horrible exhibition. I was quite a child, but I remember it. I shall never forget it whilst I remember anything. It was the first of a long series of such outrages, of which I was doomed to be a witness and a participant. It struck me with awful force. It was the blood-stained gate, the entrance to the hell of slavery, through which I was about to pass. It was the most terrible spectacle. I wish I could commit to paper the feelings with which I beheld it. Now, certainly, Douglass may have suggested that his narrative was inadequate to the horror that he witnessed, but I would maintain this is stern, hard-eyed look at the violence of slavery, and it is only one among many episodes that are woven through his narrative. And it serves, I think, to, as I said in my opening remarks, to give us an unvarnished look at the realities of slavery. Physical punishment was, if not an everyday occurrence, a common occurrence in the life of a slave, regardless of his or her station in life. And Douglass touches on other topics that other slave narratives haven't, that of the fact that even in his own background he had a white father, very probably his mother's owner, and that white slave owners would frequently force children upon their slave women because it was a way, perversely enough, of creating wealth. Those slaves, when they reached the age of 6 or 7, could be sold off, and if anything, enhanced the wealth of the slave owner. I mentioned in my earlier discussion of Harriet Beecher Stowe's fictional account of slavery, that her view stands up when we look at the writings of Frederick Douglass. Stowe concentrated on the effect slavery had on the family unit, on women and children. Douglass, as I mentioned, is an everyman. He wanders in and out of multiple situations, multiple owners, multiple cities in Maryland and other places in the South, and finally achieves freedom. And his moment of freedom, his description of that moment, is almost equally heartbreaking. He makes his way to New York and writes the following: "I've been frequently asked how I felt when I found myself in a free state. I've never been able to answer the question with any satisfaction to myself. It was a moment of the highest excitement I've ever experienced. I suppose I felt as one may imagine an unarmed mariner to feel when he is rescued by a friendly man of war from the pursuit of a pirate. In writing to a dear friend immediately after my arrival in New York, I said I felt like one who had escaped from a den of hungry lions. This state of mind, however, very soon subsided, and I was again seized with a feeling of great insecurity and loneliness. I was yet liable to be taken back and subjected to all the tortures of slavery. This in itself was enough to damp the ardor of my enthusiasm, but the loneliness overcame me." And I think in Douglass's narrative, with as many affecting moments as there is that moment that he has achieved or escaped slavery. I won't say he's achieved freedom, but he has made his way to a free state. He still would be subject to return under the fugitive slave law, but he has made it that far, and suddenly he realizes he is alone. He's been bereft of everyone he knows, of course, all of his relatives, and people he cared about he has left behind. And there he is, literally a stranger in a strange land, who has to attempt to make a life for himself. My advice to readers who wish to pursue Douglass's narrative would be to keep an eye out for several themes that persist throughout his work. One I've already mentioned, and that is the theme of the violence that hung like a threat and an everyday occurrence to slaves. The second is Douglass's own self-motivation. He heard early on from one of his owners that it would ruin a slave to educate him. And that almost lit a fuse under Douglass, because he then determined that he was going to get educated at all costs. And he did. He basically taught himself to write, taught himself to read, and at the end of his days on the plantation, he used what spare time he had to teach other slaves on the Sabbath how to read and write. So the theme of how he educated himself and the importance of education in his ultimate goal, which was to achieve freedom, is one theme to trace through the book. The other is that for the first time, and this is a theme that will be picked up by other writers even into modern times, the notion that slavery demeans not only the slave but the slave owner. I mentioned that he taught himself to read. He had a very conscientious Christian woman, Mrs. Auld, who was the wife of his owner, who sat down to teach Frederick to read along with her own son. And it was her husband, Mr. Auld, who dissuaded her from doing so, saying that if you educate a slave, you've ruined him ever after. And she obeyed her husband. And when commenting on that, Douglass makes the point that here was a fine Christian woman motivated by Christian charity, trying to do some good to a young man who was talked out of it, basically because that's not the way the institution of slavery worked. And that idea that slavery demeaned both the slaves and the slave owners is a theme that will continue not only through this period, but well into the 20th century. Writers like Faulkner, writers like James Baldwin will look back on racism and how it hurts most of all, of course, African Americans, but demeans in its own way the racists who practice it. And that's it for Douglass.